Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and specifically the joint talk and open panel with the University of Bath, entitled Cybersecurity in the Geopolitical Age. My name is Andreas Wasmuth. I'm a director here at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and also a convener for philosophy and world affairs. And this is part of the World Affairs series tonight. So a very warm welcome. So it's my job today to introduce far more speakers than I'm used to. I normally introduce one speaker, and I can just about remember all their details without having to read it off a script. With five, that's beyond me. So I'm going to introduce our chair, David, and then the four panel members. And if you could just give a round of applause to each of them when I've actually introduced them. So here we go. Our chair tonight is David Galbraith, is Professor of War and Technology at the University of Bath, what a title, and Deputy Director of the Bath Institute for Digital Security and Behavior. His research is on how technology shapes militaries, operations, and outcomes. Most recently, he was funded by the Australian Army to deliver a research project on the digital security of battle management systems. He is also a former editor of the European Journal of International Security, Defense Studies, and European Security. Please give him a round of applause. Next on our first panel is Dennis Broders, is Professor of Global Security and Technology, is a Senior Fellow of the Hague Program on International Cybersecurity at Institute of Security and Global Affairs of Leiden University, and project coordinator of EU Cyber Direct. His research and teaching broadly focuses on the interaction between international security, technology, and policy, with specific areas of interest in global security, international cybersecurity governance, and emerging technologies. He teaches in the bachelor program Security Studies and is in the master program at the Cybersecurity Academy. Professor Broders has been appointed as Bath Global Chair for 2023-2024. Right, we now come to Alexander Evans, who is a professor in practice at the London School of Economics School of Public Policy and program director of the MPA in Data Science for Public Policy. Alexander Evans' previous academic posts have included being the Henry Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, a Senior Fellow at Yale, and a William Gibbon Fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford. He has a PhD in politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. A career diplomat, he has worked as an advisor to the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street, Strategy Director in the Cabinet Office, and a Director of Cyber in the Foreign Office. He has served as Deputy and Acting High Commissioner to India and briefly Pakistan, led the United Nations Security Council expert group on Daesh, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, and has been a senior advisor to Ambassador Richard Holbrooks in the US Department of State. He was awarded an OBE for his work in Pakistan, where he led the UK's work on the tribal areas from 2007 to 2009. Please put your hands together for Alexander. What a panel already, and it gets better. Elizabeth Kolade is a cybersecurity professional at Resilience Technologies, who has been involved in the strategy, creation, and implementation of security measures, and the delivery of cybersecurity awareness across critical organizations. Elizabeth has served as an analyst, technical specialist, and advisor over the course of her career across government, private sector, and civil society. Elizabeth is a fellow of the Young African Leaders Initiative, and has been a part of several multi-stakeholder engagements on cybersecurity in and outside Africa. She was listed as one of the top 50 women in cybersecurity in Africa in 2020. Elizabeth served as a member of the Presidential Committee, which has reviewed and produced Nigeria's national cybersecurity policy and strategy in 2021. She is currently the Executive Director at Resilience Technologies. And finally, Dr. Andre Barina is Associate Professor in International Relations at the University of Bath. His work has been published in journals such as International Affairs, Mediterranean Politics, Third World Quarterly Journal of Common Market Studies, European Security, and the Journal of European Integration. He's also one of the authors of International Relations Now and Then, Routledge edition, second edition. Rina is currently working on cyber diplomacy as an emerging field in international relations. Well, now that I've got through all of that, I'll hand over to our chair, David, to start the panel discussion. All the very best. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Andres. Today we're going to talk about cybersecurity in detail, but probably within the context I think that we can all appreciate. I suspect if we were talking about artificial intelligence, we would probably fill several rooms. In fact, because AI is on the top of the headlines now more than ever, while cybersecurity barely gets a look in. But needless to say, all these things are interconnected. So AI and cyber and other types of digital security are kind of fundamental to our now, much less the future. And so therefore, I think that actually the way that we think about cybersecurity and the way that we're beginning to think about artificial intelligence in terms of the international relations, the international cooperation, the norm making, and fundamentally the diplomacy that makes all that happen is fundamentally a part of the picture. And we can only hope that actually that other forms of technological innovation actually have such a platform on which to cooperate and coordinate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first hand over to my colleague, Andre, to first, in a sense, to give us an idea of where cyber diplomacy comes in and what it is and exactly. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. So cyber diplomacy is a fairly recent term, and the first known reference to cyber diplomacy actually comes from the late 90s, 96, when a Canadian official used the term for the first time, referring to the way that diplomacy could use information technology in order to improve its activity, right? So in a slightly different way from the way we nowadays talk about cyber diplomacy. It would take almost 20 years for the term to really gain traction. And whereas nowadays a lot of people talk about cyber diplomacy, one of the first references to it as basically the use of diplomatic resources to deal with issues around cyberspace comes from 2010, 2012. For example, Paul Myers, a former Canadian diplomat, was one of the first to actually write in text, and I have a quote here very briefly, that diplomatic process of exploring possible international cooperation to build resilience in cyberspace against threats. This all seems quite normal nowadays, but actually the text is only from 2012, and it shows that at the time was seen as something more or less new. But Alexander is here and he was very much involved in the process at the time as a practitioner, so he'll be able to confirm or deny this. I think what is interesting to explore a bit here is why did we go from this first use of cyber diplomacy in 96 about the advantages of using technology in the diplomatic function to this idea of using that diplomacy as a necessary institution to deal with the problems coming from or deriving from cyberspace. And I'd say there are three factors that led to this. The first one is obviously the rapid expansion of the internet. And if you just for you to have an idea, in 1995 there were 16 million users worldwide. There were 60 million users worldwide. In 2005, we had 1 billion. So within 10 years, we went from 16 million to 1 billion internet users. Around 6 billion use the internet nowadays, right? So the rise has been exponential, and in this case, really exponential in the right sense of the word. The second aspect here is the geographic shift in terms of internet users. It's not that people in some parts of the world stop using the internet, but simply that other specific parts of the world start using it more. And nowadays, Asia, for example, has more internet users than the rest of the world put together. And the most interesting thing is that with the exception of Africa, Asia is the second continent with the lowest penetration rate when it comes to internet usage. So that means it has the second highest, in terms of percentage of people that are still to use the internet, it's the second continent in terms of the highest margin for progression. So that means that within 10, 20 years, the numbers will be even more staggering, and Asia will be by far the most dominant continent in this regard. So this already leads to a specific problem, which is a lot of the way the internet has been used and developed and the standard set has been mostly Western-centric. And the fact that we have a significant part of the world outside the West now using the same technology has necessarily led to some confrontations in terms of how the internet should work and how what should be the principles underpinning its usage. Finally, to add to this, we also start witnessing the use of information technology for malicious purposes. And since the late 90s, we start seeing the first large-scale cyber espionage operations. And progressively, as we move into the noughties, we start seeing attacks from state to state or from state proxy to state. We had the famous case of Estonia in 2007, when after the removal of the Soviet soldier from the center of Tallinn, there were significant cyber attacks against Estonia infrastructure and against Estonia services. And in 2007 already, Estonia was a highly digitalized society. And so this had a huge effect and a huge impact in Estonia. It lasted for around 3 weeks. And I think more importantly than the actual consequences of the attack in terms of the financial consequences, I think it really changed the mindset of policymakers regarding the importance of this topic. So when you put all of this together, it's not particularly surprising that governments around the world decided to invest more in this domain and actually send diplomats to the forefront of these international discussions and negotiations on the issue, often within the context of the United Nations, but not only, as my colleagues I'm sure will have the opportunity to talk about this. So to sum up and to finally answer directly the question that David asked me, together with my colleague Thomas Renard, we have defined cyber diplomacy as specifically the use of diplomatic resources and the performance of diplomatic functions to secure national interests with regards to cyberspace. And one of the reasons why we thought it was important to establish this definition was so that we did not confuse cyber diplomacy with other uses of technology, which would be more appropriately labeled as electronic diplomacy or digital diplomacy, that, as I said earlier, is more to do with how you use technology to improve the diplomatic service. A very, very final point, just to say that despite all this, cyber diplomacy is probably a transient concept in the sense that the way technology is unfolding means what diplomats do in this domain is also quickly changing. And David talked about AI and all the other challenges that are coming up, and that will certainly shape the way the profession will unfold in this domain in the near future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andre, for that. I mean, at the time, I was spending a lot of time in Estonia. I used to do a lot of work on Russians outside of Russia and the Baltic states, and I can say that the cyber attacks had a huge impact on the Estonian economy at the time, to where they really froze or blocked the banks. And so if you didn't have any, in a sense, kind of hard savings, it was really difficult for you to operate financially for about a 3-week period. And so it was a very difficult time for the Estonian people or Estonian society, as far as that's concerned. But interestingly enough, the bronze soldier was being moved away from a tram stop to a cemetery. So you can't please everyone, I guess. But the question next I have is, why does diplomacy matter in this space? And Dennis, I wonder if I could turn to you to ask this question.
Sure. This is highly scripted because I have a notes. So between the mood lighting and my handwriting, I hope I can use the notes. So I think it's important and sort of picking up on something Andre already said. So we see an increase of offensive behavior, intelligence, operations, etc. in this space. And the situation we have now, Lucas Kello of Oxford University calls it a period of unpeace. So it's not actually war, but it's also not peace. So there's a lot going on below what they call in international law the threshold of armed conflict. So then if you're above that, then international law kicks in terms of law of armed conflict. If you're below that, there's sort of a gray zone, right? So it's unpeace, it's gray. We don't know exactly what it is and how it happens. But what we see there is the behavior of states in this gray zone. If there is no rules, agreements, standards, law regulating it, what you will get is, in the end, is that the behavior of the states that dare the most, that are most obtrusive, etc., they will set the norm for you, right? So if you don't regulate anything, then in principle, what will come from that is the norms that were set by the most active players. So we get the norms set by Russia, by China, by the United States, by the UK, perhaps, we don't really know. But North Korea, Iran. So that's something where we're not really sure that that's a good way to go. And this is basically one of those moments where the diplomats come in, right? So the diplomats are there to sort of behold that kind of situation and think, okay, what are the rules of the road for state behavior here? What is, and they call it in the UN, what is a framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace? Part of it organized by international law, law of armed conflict, but part of it especially in that gray zone, the zone underneath that. Because states are sometimes clear about that certain cyber operations, they're out of bounds, right? They don't like what's going on. They think it's too transgressive and they bring out attribution statements. At the same time, what we see is that they, lack the language to sort of make the condemnation stick, and sometimes they don't use the language that is available. So that's another point we may want to debate. And you need basically diplomats to build a consensus on a framework, on rules of the road that will determine how and if you can call out states when they transgress the norms, right? But you need that first. And that's actually quite hard for different reasons. One, you need global consensus. I mean, that is always hard, but in the current time frame, I think it's even harder than it used to be. And on the other hand, the behavior of the big states also translates a little bit in the way they behave in these negotiations. Big states like what we call strategic ambiguity, right? They like it if not everything is pinned down because they are also the movers and shakers in that domain, right? And once you start laying down the rules, they do not only apply to your adversaries, they would also apply to you. I mean, obviously there's some states who don't care about these things. They will never be controlled by these kind of things, but it becomes, once you start putting out certain norms, certain standards, they become a yardstick to measure behavior against. So that's their function. I think it's important. And the last reason I penned down for why it's important, also building a little bit of what Andre said, cyber diplomacy is changing, right? We talked about it this morning. I said, I'm not sure we're going to be talking about cyber in 10 years from now, right? Also doesn't really matter because the field will change and then the norms will change with it. That's not a problem. What we've seen in the still fairly short history of cyber diplomacy was first very much UN-based first committee. So the first committee is international peace and security, disarmament. So very much focused on war and peace. How does cyber war, is that a thing? If so, how does that work? Now we see more layers added, right? So increasingly you see, coming back to sort of cyber and digital, these things are coming closer together, right? So we're also talking about digital innovation. We're talking about new technologies. We're talking about development of AI. We now have a parallel debate internationally about AI, what is responsible use of AI, human-centric use of AI, etc. There's lots of lofty terms going around, but there's also debate on the use of AI in the military domain, which you're probably well familiar with. So there's a lot going on at the same time. And another thing that you see also in the negotiations that I have, we're also increasingly talking about supply chains. So how have we organized the digital economy, the way we trade? But we're also really confronted now with the fact that these supply chains, they bring a lot of vulnerabilities, right? So they are all there, But once there's a kink, once someone wants to weaponize this, for example, then we have a problem. So increasingly, we see a lot of debate about geoeconomics, about economic security. How do we see this digital world also in a sense of what are our dependencies, what are our interdependencies, how do we deal with that, and what do we do with them? So that also becomes part of the whole debate. So in short, I think cyber diplomacy has a rich future ahead of it, because there's a lot of things to sort out. At the moment, well, it never moved fast, but at the moment it really moves at a snail's pace, and it has everything to do with the geoeconomic times we live in. But I think, yeah, it's important to keep pushing, because if we don't push on a certain set of a framework, state behavior will push anyway, right? So you need to keep these in some sort of balance. I'll leave it at that for now.
So I'd just like to follow up maybe with a small question. That is the way that you talk about it seems to be mixing two things. One is almost arms control to something like chemical weapons convention that tries to stop bad behavior.
Yeah.
But it's also, in a sense, like international trade agreements where you try to build up standard setting.
Yeah.
And I think about the use of Internet of Things, like refrigerators that talk to the internet as being vehicles for cyber crimes, for instance.
It's really interesting, because when I started out working on these kind of things, right, and I would talk about the internet, my main conversation partners would be the Ministry of Economic Affairs. We would talk about innovation, we talk about investment, etc. And then fast forward 5, 6, 7 years, and now all of a sudden I'm talking with generals and national security people, and it's both, right? I mean, just like Andre said, I mean, this technology has taken over the world, has wired the world while we were not watching, right? Basically, I mean, how do you go from 16 million to 6 billion in that time? And we use it seamlessly and without really thinking about it, right? We stream, we do everything and every innovation we see, and then we go, okay, that's okay then. That's okay, that's the norm now. So, but in doing that, we've built huge potential with this technology, but we also built something that we now all depend on. And we've also seen that there are states out there who are quite willing to use the technology for their own strategic purposes, using it for misinformation, using it for cyber operations, using it for intelligence. So all these arguably traditional security concerns are now inserted in this technology, and now we have to make sense of it and say, okay, what do we do with this, right? So intelligence was something that also happened, but now all of a sudden it's at a scale where we're thinking, oh, hang on, is this still the same thing? Or is it different? Or what do we think of this? We also see intelligence agencies doing all kinds of things that are not necessarily intelligence gathering, for example. What do we think of that?
Yeah.
What is, and it's the noble task of diplomats to try to figure that one out. So
Yeah, thank you very much. Alexander, I was wondering if I could talk to you really about the British experience and having an insider's view of how the British government has sought to engage both its allies, I guess, in particular, but also the international community in trying to bring forward a cyber diplomacy framework.
Well, thank you. First of all, obviously, I don't speak for the British government, which is a great relief, because otherwise I'd be sitting here with a script and I'd be worrying about my WhatsApps. In neither circumstance am I in right now. So what you're going to get is my personal and possibly eccentric views. But first of all, I want to sort of, in a sense, agree with what Dennis has set out. We are living in a very different world, self-evidently, to the 1990s. Remember 1990s? Everything seemed so optimistic then. And technology was going to transform our world for better. War was so 1980s, wasn't it? So 1980s. And actually, we've moved from, if you like, peak optimism about tech into actually a dangerous peak pessimism about tech. And perhaps that's something to come back to. Because I think we do have to be careful about how much a generational mood can distort policymaking and decision-making, not just about technology or cyber diplomacy, but about everything. But I was asked specifically about what about British diplomacy? Well, look, some of it was what diplomats have always done. We sat in other countries and talked to people. Occasionally we've listened to people. Apparently that's quite good for diplomacy as well. We've gone to international conferences. We've drafted communiques. We've said good and noble things in statements that will be remembered for decades.
But so, if you like, the ordinary business of diplomacy incorporated some of the issues that are relevant for cyber. The questions of avoiding inadvertent conflict, the questions of attributing malign behavior by states. That preceded the world of cyber we moved into, but the world of cyber we moved into has reframed it in many different ways. So but let me pick a few things, if I may. Andre is quite right to say that this particular subreddit of cyber diplomacy is relatively novel. And actually, in practical terms, you hear diplomats talking about it really over the last 10, 15 years, with an acceleration over the last decade. But perhaps let me take sort of 4 or 5 themes where this becomes a live policy issue, and therefore a live issue for advice to ministers and to prime ministers about what to do. One of those is about attribution. The British Library has undergone a cyber attack this week. And relevant from my side, I'm on the advisory council of the British Library. The NHS has suffered it, universities have suffered it, governments have suffered it, central banks have suffered cyber attacks. But the reality is our lives now are digital by default. Many of us consume more words every day through digital means than we do from analog means. So if the bulk of our surface of engagement with data and words and information and instructions is the shopping list that my partner sends me. Don't forget to do the Ocado order on Wednesday, right? And here's what I want. That's much more likely to be encoded in a WhatsApp than a post-it note on the fridge. And that means that the area of vulnerability for us all is everywhere. It's everything everywhere all at once. And that frames a different type of risk vector for all governments to think about, not just the UK. So first thing is the strategic operating environment has changed. It's not just about what happens in London or in Whitehall buildings. It's about what happens in every town and every community across the UK. I think the second thing is attribution is one thing. If you're saying, you're pointing at somebody, look, you just sent your tank across the border. Attribution is very different if you're trying to ascertain who or what was responsible for a cyber attack conducted across international borders using a variety of different means, where the protagonist may well be trying to conceal their authorship or involvement in that attack. But the decision about attribution is really important. If I know that Andre stole my cup of coffee, there'll be consequences. I'd never drink enough coffee in the morning. If I can't be sure that Andre was the person who stole it, I can't apply consequences in the same way. So this is where the full capacity of the state becomes very important to try and identify who or what was responsible. What was novel, I think, in cyber diplomacy on the peace and security agenda was trying to work out, what do you then do? So I've learned that Andre stole my cup of coffee. I've got irrefutable proof. I've got the WhatsApps. I'm confident that they haven't been invented, but it's not deep fakes. It's not generative. What can I do to you now? Well, I could issue a stern statement saying, I know you stole my cup of coffee, and I could tell you that bilaterally. But that might not dissuade him from stealing my cup of coffee on Friday morning. So I might actually want to issue a public statement. Tell all of you, it's outrageous. Did you see what Andre did? I know you didn't see, but I've got proof. Here's the WhatsApp that proves that Andre stole my coffee. That, again, might not be enough. So what states did in recent years, and certainly like-minded states in the West, developed a cyber sanctions regime. So Andre stole my coffee. I attributed it. I named him for stealing my coffee. I shamed him a little bit by declaring publicly that he was the person who stole my coffee. But now I need to take further steps. So I might actually put him on a sanctions list in Europe, for example, or a sanctions list in the UK, or a sanctions list elsewhere, which would, it might not stop you stealing a cup of coffee, but it's going to stop you coming on holiday to go shopping in the Bath Christmas market. And it's going to stop you from being able to open a bank account in the UK. And it certainly would complicate your ability to do things in Europe. So the argument of sanctions was having certain degrees of consequences that might also act as a deterrent, but also encourage everybody else to wake up. Wait a minute, are people stealing coffees in Bath? I had no idea. I thought that happened in Bristol. So this sense of how do you basically also make people more aware of some of these risks. So attribution sanctions, 2 ingredients. But another ingredient has been this issue around standards. Standards were, historically kind of pretty dull. Sorry, with apologies to anybody in the audience who does standards. I realize I've lost you now. But let me roll back. Who remembers VHS versus Betamax in the early 1980s? Remember? Who won the video wars, right? Pretty obscurantist, unless you're of a certain age where suddenly your eyes light up and you remember that pile of VHS videotapes you've still got in the attic somewhere. But there was an actual format war, a standards war between VHS and Betamax, but VHS won. Why it won is less material than the fact whoever won out of VHS or Betamax, it was a Western standard that would predominate. That is no longer guaranteed in the world that we live in now. And so this model of a default assumption that the standards that would dominate would be our standards, or at the very least the standards of our friends, has given way to a much more contested world of standards, some of which is going to be determined by sheer economic weight, the biggest company in the block, the biggest data lake in the world, some of which may be determined by the easiest committee with which to organize any weekend activities, which is the committee of 193 countries called the General Assembly of the United Nations. And if 193 countries have got a vote, that standard may be shaped by the key in that community rather than a certain part of it. So one final thing and then shut up. So obviously all of this has grown. My view slightly is it's just diplomacy. We can get a little bit overexcited by branding it this or branding it that. But that having been said, I really enjoyed being cyber director in the Foreign Office. And the role still exists. But just 2 quick comments if I may. There's also this big debate about standards, which is relatively new, about norms, which is old. The norms of behavior in lots of different spaces, and about rules. To what extent do you need treaties or laws to enforce some of this? I agree with Dennis that I think we're in a period of inflection right now where actually we do need to properly debate where is it more appropriate to think about rules rather than norms, or rules and norms rather than standards. But we should be wary about rules. And Dennis, forgive me, you've heard me say this before. The classic case in point, I live in North London. You may be aware that there's a 20-mile-an-hour driving speed limit in North London. That is the law. That is a rule. It is not widely enforced, right? If I walk out and assume that 20 miles an hour is going to be the speed that cars are going on my road, I will endanger myself and my family. Standing on the right side of the tube escalator is not a law. It is a norm. But if any of you find it difficult to break into social contact with Londoners, known for their friendly ways and their openness to social interaction, I recommend you try and stand on the left-hand side of a tube escalator, whether at rush hour or at any time of your choosing, and just work out if some form of social engagement takes place. A little bit of muttering, perhaps. So norms can sometimes be much more load-bearing than laws. And laws can sometimes be much more load-bearing than norms. And I think part of the navigation in the future is working out, and that's where the strategic content of cyber diplomacy comes in, which is a lot of what you're trying to advise on and do is not just a reaction to what happened yesterday in a particular attack. It's anticipating what the world is going to look like in 10 or 15 years' time, and trying to make the right bets on what kind of capabilities would Britain need, what kind of policies should we pursue, and what do we do with like-minded partners to make ourselves safer in a fully digital world.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You've besmirched both Bristol and London in your comments, so we'll take that.
I'm playing to the boss.
Elizabeth, when we think about cyber security or cyber attacks, quite often when we think about something like Stuxnet or the way that North Korea uses the crypto markets in order to fund its own activities, we seem to concentrate or attribute a lot to states in that way. What role do other actors have in this kind of this network that everyone can plug into?
Thank you very much for that question. Like everyone has mentioned today, when we talk about cyber diplomacy and how diplomats engage and interact, I think Andrea also highlighted this, how governments, diplomats have conversations and make negotiations on behalf of governments. But like you said, this is not a space that is for government actors alone, for state actors alone. While government and state actors have the responsibility to safeguard national interest and national security, the cybersecurity space is one that is quite different. When Dennis was speaking, he mentioned supply chain. Now, when you look at how different states and how different governments operate, the providers of these services, we find most of them in the private sector. They are the ones that actually come up with some of these digital services and softwares and solutions that different states use. So an attack, a direct attack on a government organization would most likely hit an organization like Microsoft that provides some of these software solutions. So in this case, we cannot then say that the government alone is responsible for coming up with agreements or making negotiations as it relates to cyber diplomacy. So we need to look at the role that non-state actors in this space, private sector like Microsoft, have to play in this. And in talking about cyber diplomacy, it's also important that we understand what exactly it is that we want to protect. If we're talking about protecting critical infrastructure for different states and different nations, it's important that we understand what exactly it is that we want to protect. And the diplomat who goes to the conversation may not exactly have a full picture of what the threats that faces us as a nation, that's speaking in person of the diplomat. So it's important to have non-state actors like the technical community also be a part of some of these conversations to shed light on what the threats are, what's the reality is. As we have conversations, we need to understand what exactly it is that we are trying to protect. Referring to non-state actors, I have mentioned technical community and private sector. We also have civil society, because at the core of all of this, we have people. We want to protect people. So we have a wide range of civil society organizations who bring a wide range of diversity to the conversation on cyber diplomacy. So we need to look at what human rights. We need to ensure that as we try to protect state interests, we don't lose human rights. We need to ensure that we are able to protect the privacy of people, and people can function efficiently. Because that's what makes up the state. The citizen is what makes up the state. We cannot then leave the conversation on cyber diplomacy to just state actors alone, to state representatives. It's important that we have these non-state actors, as they are referred to come and become a part of this conversation to help us define what exactly it is we are trying to protect, to help us to have an understanding of what exactly it is that we are trying to protect. Andre mentioned the need to build resilience. When we're talking about cyber diplomacy, we want to be able to build the resilience for a nation, for a state. And we need to look at what some of the smaller components that makes up the bigger picture for a state who goes into a conversation to talk about what the benefits and opportunities for us as a state is as it relates to cybersecurity. So different actors, but I think this is commonly referred to as a multi-stakeholder space. So there are different stakeholders that come together to have this conversation to ensure that we come up with effective agreements that actually reflects what the realities of society is in the long run.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you very much, Elizabeth. I know that I was participating quite often in discussions with the Cabinet Office around the ability to start drones or UAVs in terms of like deliveries for Amazon and things like this, because there's a wide governmental interest in this, from transportation to obviously defense and so on. And policing and so on. And one of the interesting things is having not only the UK government represented at that meeting, but also how you try to engage the industry, both as, you know, from the Googles and the Microsoft down to you know, bit makers or chip makers, or those who build the bodies of these delivery mechanisms, or who work on the landing programming for these UAVs and so on. it really is an interesting, in a sense, kind of layer of the industry or slice of the industry that gives you an example of all the things or complication that goes into it. And I think cyber is a very good, you know, as Elizabeth has said, is also a very good, interesting case of how presenting a slice of that industry is kind of fundamental to getting cyber right. Can we say that? One of the interesting, I think, things for me is how, whether or not this is, as you were saying, kind of diplomacy like any other diplomacy, and if there's something in particular around, and yeah, Alexandra, if there's something particularly around trying to do diplomacy around something that seems to be constantly evolving, and the challenges that presents diplomacy.
No, that's fair, and one of the things that frankly appealed to me about getting engaged with cyber diplomacy in British diplomacy is it's a massive canvas, right? You're talking about everything. You're talking about positive things as well as negative things. You're talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. There is still a significant technology opportunity, both globally and within the UK, and it's important not to lose sight of some of that as well. But there is also, lots of malign activity, not just by states. Actually, the bulk of malign activity in cyberspace is by criminal groups. It's theft, it's ransomware, it's attacks on people, etc., etc. But there is also this sort of ugly dimension about, something that's a little bit more existential, which is what is the risk about interstate conflict? How do you know for sure that what you're seeing on a screen represents what's actually happening? And if we think that is science fiction, and we think it sounds a bit like war games in the 1980s, let's just remember that in 1983, it was only the actions of a Russian colonel who decided to disregard a signal implying that there was a missile attack taking place from the USA to the USSR that saved us from a very likely nuclear conflict. For me, the 1983 crisis was much more serious point in the Cold War than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And everybody likes to talk about JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis. People don't tend to like very much to talk about a slightly nerdy question about who saw what on a screen that was suppressed at the time and only became public later. So lots of things in lots of different ways. And actually, this is where it echoes, I think, Elizabeth's point. There's no way that governments have the human capital, that's a technical term for people, by the way, to do this in-house, right? There isn't enough expertise, even with the extraordinary depth of GCHQ, even with our fintech sector, financial regulators and others who work on this. We need to reach out beyond government. And you need to do that as much on digital liberty as on cybersecurity. And the key there is also making sure that you're cultivating the kind of experts and the small and medium-sized companies of tomorrow that can support some of that. Government's not very good at talking to outsiders. And I'll just share a very brief example of that. When the Foreign Office Policy Planning Staff was established in the 1960s, so a small group of people to think radical thoughts about the future. One of the first people in it was asked, he said, well, what's my job? What am I meant to do? And they said, go out and talk to people outside and find out what their views are and bring them into government and, cross-pollinate. And he said, this disturbed me deeply because he said, throughout my Foreign Office career, I'd been told that soldiers were stupid, that journalists were untrustworthy, and that Chatham House was a nest of communist spies. So the idea that I would actually have a job where I would be encouraged to do that all the time was very disturbing. And I would still say that the default setting for many officials is internally focused rather than externally focused. And I think actually everything now is so complex and there's so much risk associated with different strands of the cyber, digital, AI and data agenda. But it's absolutely essential for people to go out of government. And from my perspective, it's really important that we break down the walls of Whitehall. The civil service for a long time has been a little bit like the Ford factory in Dagenham in 1978. You got your golden ticket to get in, and then you kept all the windows and doors tightly closed to avoid unnecessary drafts. This agenda is so important that we need to basically have much greater porosity in and out of government. Porosity, by the way, is not a synonym for politicization. You don't have to have lots of special advisors running left, right, and centre, but we do need to open up government to external insight and to the insight and challenge that comes from multi-stakeholder perspectives.
Yeah, great. One of the great things that's happened over the last few years are these Research Council funded policy fellowships that you have that brings academics and parts of the university into government departments. And so that's been very, I think, very useful, hopefully for government as much as it has been for economic, for academic publication. Dennis, can you tell us something about kind of, if we think about cyber diplomacy now, what are the kind of the contemporary and emergent issues that are happening?
I think it depends really who you ask, right? So it's a big world out there, 193 states. Some of them want very different things. So we are very accustomed to think about cyber diplomacy. We have the like-minded, which is roughly the West, and some few add-ons on one end. I think they're still mainly interested in sort of figuring out how international law applies in cyber, how we can develop a framework for responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and that's the core of what they're after. And then to the other side, we have Russia. Let's not forget, Russia was the one who instigated this whole process, right? It was a Russian resolution in 1998 that started this whole process. And oh, irony, the resolution that they brought forward was, okay, guys, there's this really new technology and it's kind of frightening because we're really afraid that people are going to use information weapon against us, right? So basically what they now do best, that's what they're afraid of then and still, right? They still want to shield their own information sphere as best as possible. So that already leads you to what they want, right? They want sort of the idea of sovereignty, of sovereign control over parts of the internet. That's the core of their message. They would like to take as much away from the multi-stakeholder community and move it to multilateral commissions. Yeah, so why don't we do the vital resources of the internet, IP addresses and DNS, etc.? Why don't we move it to the ITU? Because then we have more control over it as a system. And then there's a plethora on other countries which sometimes are digitizing at breakneck speed at the moment, have all kinds of different hang-ups. Cybercrime is much more important than interstate conflict in many parts of the world, so that's much more a consideration. Capacity building in all shapes and forms, and then primarily capacity building on a demand-driven basis, not on whatever the Western countries and China have left lying around. So there's a lot of different views. If you look at what's on the table now, I think it's almost like an evergreen. So in 2010 already, 2013, already the UN GGE, which is the main forum where they discuss these things, said, okay, international law applies in cyberspace as it does in real life, which is sort of the chorus we still sing. And then the next question is, that's great, how? Right, and we're still doing that. We're still trying to get countries to be more explicit and say, okay, if you say sovereignty is a thing, when is it violated in a cyber operation? On the other hand, you still have Russia, who since 1998 really wants a treaty. So they want a different way of organizing this. They don't want a normal application. They want a specified treaty for cyberspace, which will give them opportunity to move things more towards a sovereigntist vision. That's one of the main things that's on the table, I think. And another irony is that Russia and China have always sort of beaten the drum of cyber sovereignty. And cyber sovereignty was related to information security, right? Because that was the thing they feared most, right? So unwelcome information for the regime, they want to be able to control that. The West was always beating on the drum. No, this is a global system. It's open, it's free, information will circulate, and that's a good thing, etc. Now, after a long while of misinformation, disinformation, information operations, etc., that's one of them, and B, economic security concerns. So we're now so interdependent with this system that increasingly Western states are now also starting to talk about sovereignty in cyberspace. So the European Union calls it strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty, but it has to do about what level of control do we also want to have over information flows, over dependencies, supply chain issues, etc. So that logic is now sort of permeating on the Western side, and not without some glee. Some of the other sides are going, what took you so long, right? We've been here all along. We've been talking about sovereignty all along. So now we're also talking about what does it mean to argue as Western countries in favor of some degree of sovereignty in relation to the internet without losing track of multi-stakeholder community, without losing track of fundamental rights and freedoms, etc. So we're doing a really complicated balancing act. And that's one of the things I think that is really on the table. Also at the moment, and that's pure procedurally, things are moving at a snail's pace, right? There's not much moving, as it's like watching grass grow at the moment. So in that sense, there's really not much going on.
Right.
But these are the underlying issues that are gonna constantly pop up in all these debates. And there's movement, of course, in the third committee on the cybercrime treaty, but that's slightly different, but it's related. And then there's all the international debates about the real world reference, about AI and what form of AI, not fast forward 5 years, and then we're doing the same with quantum. So
yeah.
Can I just add something? Because I don't think the audience knows a lot about these UN processes that we've been talking about. So there's the first committee where we had all discussions about international peace and security, norms of responsible state behavior, etc. But in the last few years, we also been discussing the possibility of an international treaty to address cybercrime specifically. And the interesting thing is that in both cases, Russia has been taking the lead. So it was Russia that, as Dennis said, promoted the resolution in 1998 that kickstarted the conversation. They were the ones promoting the creation of a group of governmental experts, later on an open-ended working group, and now the Cybercrime Convention. So it's quite interesting the role Russia has been playing here as almost a norm entrepreneur in this domain, despite the general perception that Russia tends to be one of the biggest rule breakers when it comes to cyberspace.
both can be true at once. Welcome to Russia.
I'm very conscious of the fact that we've had our allotted time to really talk to one another, and I think it would be fantastic if we could open ourselves up to questions from the audience. I know that questions have been popping up behind us here as well. I'm not sure how we go about trying to see those, but yes, please.
Sarah and I will do a double up. So
Okay.
I'll do the online audience and see what they've got to say, and Sarah's going to do the audience in the room. And as you say, there's quite a few have come up online already. I think it's quite interesting. There's been so many dimensions already discussed, in terms of levels. We're talking about groups, we're talking about organizations, we're talking about countries, and all have they're all agents with different motives and different backgrounds, which is quite interesting. And that to explore that further would be interesting. Also interesting is that you concentrate on cyber diplomacy, but there's also cybersecurity that we also need to take into consideration. And we need to let Andre off the hook. He probably didn't steal the coffee. So over to the people in the room.
False flag operation.
Yes.
Or should we start maybe with one online and then? Oh, there's one. Okay, yeah, we've just got one here.
Great, asking a question about a topic I have no idea about to this day. Thank you. Curious. Many people feel quite uncomfortable about the fact that large tech organizations have such a strain and control over what's considered nowadays as critical infrastructure, whether it be Facebook controlling most of the ways we communicate, or maybe it's Visa and MasterCard controlling most of the ways we pay with our wallets, basically. They feel quite uncomfortable with that because they feel like these companies can go against the public interest and do something that will devastate people. I mean, we saw how effective that was when credit card companies left Russia during the invasion. That put a stop on how people paid for a while. So how real is this threat for this to happen? And what is the international community doing about this? That'd be quite a fascinating topic to discuss. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone, please?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. It's something that a lot of people also probably around here have been spending quite a lot of time thinking about. So what happens when companies become public utilities, right? That's one of the things that's behind this. And I mean, you can say about big oil what you want, but it's not the same as someone organizing your public domain, basically, right? So to a certain extent, it's private ownership, it's what they created, and you sort of have to deal with it. But you see a lot of worry about it, and you see a lot of interference with it. And I think it's good because we've seen, especially in the beginning of cyber, we saw a lot of public-private partnerships, right? That was the language. We're all partners, etc. It's all nice. We go down the river singing Kumbaya, and it's not like that, right? It doesn't work that way because yes, there are moments when governments and companies align, and there are moments when they do not align, right? And especially these global operating companies, a lot of them, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So it is not one company in the sense that it behaves everywhere the same. It behaves different in different markets because markets. And so there's a lot of things to unpack. And one of the interesting things is slightly different, but there was an attack in the United States on Colonial Pipeline, right? That's a big hack. And that's energy infrastructure, basically, right? So nobody could take in gas. So what kicks in is, okay, critical infrastructure protection, etc. Later, it turned out that the problem for Colonial was not that they couldn't pump gas. They could still pump gas. The problem was their payment system. They couldn't get paid for gas. So now we have a situation in which the government has designated something as a critical infrastructure that needs to be protected, needs to be operational, where a company makes a perfectly sensible business decision to say, we're not pumping gas if we're not getting paid. So there you have public interest, private interest, and the digital domain, and especially with these big companies, are going to have all kinds of these intersections. And we don't have it fully thought through yet. And I think especially for those organizations that actually organize part of our public domain, the bar is higher, right? I mean, it has to be higher. But you see how it goes, right? Elon Musk takes over Twitter. Everything that had to do with ethics, content control, etc., they all got chucked out minute 2, right? And that was the result of a long conversation between companies and governments about their ethics and what they needed to do in order to... when companies talk about ethics, they fear regulation. That's what it is, right? That's why they talk about ethics. Then they'll do ethics committees, etc. No, they will do it. So here you have things where we have to be perhaps also a little bit more savvy as governments, I think.
Thank you. Lucas.
Hi, yes. Can no one hear me? Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everyone. My question is, I think, almost for everyone in the panel, but it touches upon a little bit of what Alexander was talking about in terms of the problem of expertise. And I'm especially reminded about some of these hearings in the US Senate with Mark Zuckerberg and the representative of TikTok, who, I mean, in the US in particular, is a gerontocracy. So you have a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about effectively, trying to find policy on this matter. And would you say that that's a particular problem for cyber? Or is it not? Is that a common problem? But especially if we're thinking about this, the problem of cyber being so fast-paced, is there a problem of expertise in the policy diplomatic field for this particular problem, more so than perhaps with other problems? So I'm curious if you had something to say about that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, just a quick comment. I mean, obviously we'd be shocked by the idea that people in government might talk about subjects about which they're not experts. I suspect that's not necessarily a novelty. And we've all suffered, I think, from dinner partyitis, where after a couple of glasses of red wine, we're all very willing to offer deeply informed views about AI regulation or the financial crisis, or indeed the intimate nature of British politics last week or next. So overconfidence and the challenge of being overconfident but underinformed is, I think, a universal aspect of the human condition. And I don't think it's unique to government. I think it's actually something that we all experience at different times in our lives as human beings. But to your specific question, is this more keenly felt and more keenly needed in this domain? I would say yes. And actually, it links a little bit to the last question, because in addition to cyber diplomacy, guess what? There's a whole world that's beginning of regulatory diplomacy, right? So for private companies, they often thought about regulatory risk at board level. Governments didn't tend to think about regulation at cabinet level regularly. You know, yes, if you're creating a new regulator, but it's not like it's not the weekly cabinet meeting. It's let's talk about regulation. Yeah. So one of the interesting things around this is technology, and you see this in the debate around AI. Regulatory policy across borders as well as within countries is becoming a tier one issue for national security, for democratic sovereignty. And I think we should talk about sovereignty, but we should talk about it in a way that distinguishes what we mean by it from states that are illiberal and authoritarian. And I think there's a real problem about finding people. And we're hunting for unicorns, right? We're hunting for people who in the private sector are offered very large salaries. We're hunting for people who largely don't exist. Let me give an example. We're hunting for somebody who's 1/4 regulator, 1/4 technologist, 1/4 diplomat, and 1/4 standards body specialist, right? So, you know, take that to a headhunter and see if Egon Zehnder or Russell Reynolds will supply you with a shortlist. It's a really difficult thing to do. So I think it's hugely important for government to be cultivating its own bench on some of this, which incidentally we have done before. We did it on climate. We did it during the Cold War on deterrence. We've done it before around other issues like biosecurity. But the challenge is here is pace. We need to have people very quickly. And if you're talking about the cutting edge expertise and insight, I have more interesting conversations sitting and talking to people investing in technology firms from a private equity firm in New York, or an interesting startup in Luxembourg than I do necessarily when I talk to government officials about technology and regulation. So again, it reinforces Elizabeth's point. We've got to get out there. It's not necessarily, by the way, multi-stakeholderism in the UN context, because actually most UN member states, most countries don't really believe in multi-stakeholderism, right? They'll pay lip service to it, but they won't really do it properly. It becomes hugely important in terms of domestic policy making. So for democratic countries that are pluralist, that are interested in views outside government, and even if you're not interested in views outside government, you will not make good government policy unless you are drawing on that expertise and insight, and crucially challenge from outside. Because this is an area where, like classical tragedy, we will all mostly be wrong and occasionally be right.
Okay, let's go on to a question online. And I kid you not, we have somebody by the surname Bush online. Not sure whether it's the ex-president or not, but somebody's dialing in. A different question, though, online is quantum computing going to be very significant for security? And is it going to make it worse or better?
Small question.
The short answer is yes, but we don't really know what quantum is going to do for most of the time. So when it comes to encryption, so when you encrypt data, you protect them. So the race for quantum, first and foremost, when it comes to security, is about encryption and decryption. So whoever gets it right first, they can do quantum computing. They can encrypt their own data with a key that is so complicated that normal computers are very unlikely to be able to crack it, and reverse around, right? So you can decrypt encrypted messages that are now protected with normal encryption. That, as far as I know, and I am so far from being an expert that it's not even funny anymore, but that is the main thing that we know fairly certain where quantum is going to have a huge impact. For as far as I know, but I bow to the wiser man or woman beside me, we don't really know what quantum's going to do. We know it has the potential to really shake things around, definitely in terms of computing power, but we don't really know. We don't know how far away it is. So that's the most sensible thing I can say about it.
Okay, thank you. There's one more.
Sorry, Elizabeth just had.
No, I was just going to say, I think it could go both ways, like Dennis has mentioned, and like he said, it's a race of who gets there first. Because I remember a few weeks back in the office, I can't remember the particular algorithm, but there's there's an algorithm that has gone unbroken for years, and randomly it just came on the news that it's been broken, and then everybody's like, oh, we now have a new task that we need to get to. So imagine with quantum computing, yes, it has its positives, and like Dennis said, we don't know how far it can go. So it could play both ways, essentially.
Great, please.
Okay, so the other question we've got is by Jacob online. With technology growing to such a point that it is nearly impossible to differentiate reality from fiction, how much will AI play a role in disinformation? How do we combat the future of misinformation?
Well, I think that future is already now, but I wonder if anyone would like to.
Look, I'd just say, I mean, this is not a new issue. It's been a live issue for a long time. It was a live issue even in a pre-digital age. One of the main preoccupations of the British government in the 1920s was a concern about Comintern, so communist propaganda and subversion in the United Kingdom, and the way in which that might undermine British democracy, our way of life, and our strategic interests internationally. So there is actually a bit of muscle memory here if we're interested in applied history. All too often we're looking through the rearview mirror and we're curious about what happened last week rather than what happened in 1922. And I would argue good policy making takes the long view rather than the short view on some of these things. But I think it's a really genuine concern. What happens if we are unable to verify that something is true or false? And I was reflecting on this actually yesterday in another context at something else in London. We've become used to live in a high definition world, and a high definition world in a couple of different ways. We're used to being able to navigate in high definition terms, to consume high definition content, but also to have very high definition confidence whether something is true or false. We became used to that. And I wonder, question mark, is one of the risks that we now need to entertain is the challenge that we maybe move into a low definition world in terms of veracity. And what does that then mean for electoral politics? What does it mean for ordinary life? And most of all, this concerns my students at LSE, what does it mean for online dating?
One of the things that's really remarkable, I mean, the controversies that still exist with us from the age of controversy, really the death of JFK, the death or the murder of Bobby Kennedy, to the moon landing and so on. These things really still, now this was largely a pre-digital age, but yet, and we have lots of evidence to suggest that they work the way that the official way tells us that they work. But needless to say, we still, meet people all the time that would challenge one of those things, if not all of those things, online. So there is a feeling that actually that we are still in the same world that we were before the internet was created. Please.
I think we have another question in the room, if that's okay.
Please.
Hi, round two. Wonderful. You've mentioned earlier about the VHS versus Betamax standard. I'm too young about that, but I have heard horror stories about this from my father. But you mentioned specifically that it didn't really matter who won because they were both Western standards. But now with the internet, we not only have Western standards, we have Eastern standards. Stuff like Yandex from Russia competing against Google, or WeChat from China competing against WhatsApp. You've also mentioned that most countries or the internet hasn't really developed that much in many countries in Africa and Asia. So I was really wondering, what's your guys' opinion on our relationship with these countries and how much that is impacted in which standard they will adopt, whether they adopt the Western internet standards or the Eastern internet standards, and what effect will that have in the future with our relationship with these countries?
Well, standards, I think you only generally have one set of standards. So even WeChat and other services that are offered exclusively in China or Russia still use the same internet that we use. Obviously, there's filters and there's firewalls that prevent access, but the standards are the same, right? Obviously, and this is one of the big questions, is what if we start diverging in terms of standards, right? And this is a whole discussion around the splinternet and the fragmentation of the internet. And I think some people would argue that's very difficult to happen, technically speaking. Other people would say despite all that, it's still possible. Also because we are on the cusp of the technological developments that we, as we just mentioned, don't know where they are going to lead. But I think the question about standards nowadays is more applicable to issues such as or technological domination or advantage is more related to issues such as 5G, for example, right? We had the Huawei case in which Huawei was the best placed provider for 5G across the Western world, and the way we have responded to that has been through the definition of Huawei as a security threat, right? So that is the type of advantage that is not necessarily about standards, but it's about being more sophisticated or cheaper comparing to other competitors that I think in the West we're not used to and will become a reality. But just to say that the point you made earlier, there is a very significant penetration of internet usage in Asia. What I was saying earlier is that there's still a significant part of the population that doesn't use it, but in terms of total numbers is, as I said, more than the rest of the world combined.
Yeah, thank you, Andre. Please.
Okay, the internet was started about 40 years ago by Tim Berners-Lee. So it's taken us 40 years to really think about cybersecurity. How far do we have to look ahead in the future to consider alternative forms of cybersecurity? For example, the metaverse.
Would anyone like to?
I'm confused about the question, to be honest. How does the metaverse fit into this?
It took 40 years to develop, sort of cybersecurity thinking and standards.
Yeah.
What if we're looking 40 years hence? What else might we?
Okay.
Well, first of all, Tim Berners-Lee did not invent the internet, unfortunately, for what some people would like to say. But he developed what we know as the World Wide Web, which basically sits on top of the internet infrastructure. They're slightly different. The internet actually came from a project in the United States in the 60s. That's right. Well, I think that there's a very good question there, which is when the internet was created, there were basically no security concerns. It was literally an open system for people to share information across big computers that existed in a handful of universities around mostly the United States and then extended to Europe. And so everything we've done since in terms of cybersecurity is to try to remediate the flaws that came in a system that did not think about security. Probably they're not flaws, they're the flaws come from our usage and the fact that we do not trust other users, right? And so the interesting thing is, how will this technology develop and how will we communicate in 40 years' time? We will still be using this infrastructure, we will be still using the internet, or will technology allow us to communicate in different ways that will not rely on the same standards, the same undersea cables, etc., that we currently use? Because that will be the game changer, because then cybersecurity will be something completely different. But while we use this technology or this set of technologies, I think we will be trying to just improvise, remediate what was not created to be the worldwide phenomenon that it is.
Can I sort of add one thing there? I mean, I think again, one of the things I do at LSE as a sort of recovering diplomat in my anecdotage is I teach anticipatory policy making. I teach trying to think long term and longitudinally about policy. And I think one of the Achilles heels of policy making is we don't think historically and we don't think prospectively. So we're much better at now than next. And that's, again, part of the human condition. And when we do think about the next, it's, oh goodness, when is this guy going to stop talking and can I have a glass of wine? So we're distracted in our thinking about the next as well. I think around this space, given technology is going to be so material to our economies, to our security, and to the values and our way of life, we need to be dedicating more resource to thinking about the next. Doesn't mean we're going to get the next right. It doesn't mean we're going to peer into and predict the future well. That usually ends badly. I seem to remember in the early 1980s, we'd all be learning Japanese furiously right now. But in the 70s, we thought we were going to run out of food. Remember the Club of Rome in 1973. So we've got a long and ignoble track record of getting the future wrong. But if we're not, if we're not future-minded on some of this, I think it will be damaging to our national interests and to our collective interests for liberal democratic states.
Okay, there's another question online which relates to the rules and policies I think the panel discussed earlier. This is from Duncan. Is the host country of the G7 bugging the other members considered within the rules?
What? I didn't hear the question. Could you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question from Duncan is the host country of the G7 bugging the other members considered within the rules of cybersecurity?
If you mean by bugging, listening in on them, spying on them, it's not considered polite, but it's considered within the rules, I guess. Yes. Yeah. So espionage is one of those strange creations we have that is not strictly speaking regulated under international law. Everybody knows everybody's doing it, but it's sort of an or category. But again, and this is one of my pet projects, I think the cyber domain is interesting, not so much in this case, sort of G7 eavesdropping on the negotiating partners. That is quite common, I would say. But the fact that the scale has massively altered, and one of the things I think most interesting in cyber is because cyber operations are very often, almost mostly, done by intelligence organizations. And most of the things they do are not, well, no, a large chunk of what they do are not traditional espionage cases. It's about sabotage, it's about different things, about covert operations in a digital form. And that also takes on a scale that is, I think, new and has different applications. And that is all sort of being shielded by the fact that we have this old adage that we don't talk about espionage, we don't talk about those activities. But that is sort of used now to cover a whole range of things that were not normally part of what I would say espionage. So I think there's another discussion to be had there, but different form.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, what we know in trade negotiations, for instance, is partners prior to signing, and usually a trade negotiation takes over a decade, is that there's a lot of espionage that goes on between those parties, even though they're working towards a cooperative agreement. But what they're trying to do is get a clear sense of where the other bargaining positions are of the country that they're trying to negotiate with. So it wouldn't be surprising if beyond that it doesn't happen. So, are there any further questions from the audience?
Any other further questions in the room, or we'll let Andreas?
This is your last chance. Any final burning questions? There's always going to be one. So.
Lucas,
Round
please.
two for me as well. And I'm not even sure, I only raised my hand because I saw no one else was. But I was curious if any of you could say something about the potential for conflict over the actual natural resources, the hardware that is necessary to facilitate all this technological progress. Because as someone who is not at all an expert on this field, from what I understand, there is yet again another dynamic of mass competition among both great powers over who gets access to these resources, rare minerals, etc., that would enable things like quantum computing, etc. Like, is there something that any of you can say about this? Because I know this is maybe technically not a cybersecurity question, but a cyber diplomacy question. So, yeah, I'll leave that to you. Thank you.
Well, yeah, there is, and you already see it happening, I think. So, and it's not technically cybersecurity, but it's close by. It's supply chain. So what we've seen, the United States has been heading two coalitions, basically using basically limiting access of China to high-end semiconductors, right? Chips. They have two informal coalitions, one with the Netherlands and Japan, one with Taiwan, the G4, the 4-1, etc. But that's happened, and we know that China is in control of a lot of rare earth minerals, either directly or through their investments in China. And it is widely expected that that is the button they're going to push. And it hasn't happened yet, but the Chinese have already been sending out signals. They've been sending out signals to countries in Africa if they can make an inventory of what kind of export there is, etc., which is a clear signal that for China this is something that is on the menu. And yeah, I mean, I think most people anticipated that this would be a possibility. I mean, that's, yeah, because you find what the vulnerable point is, right? So, and for China, it's access to the high-end semiconductors, but they know where our vulnerabilities are. That's and that's often rare earth minerals because we don't have them ourselves.
Can I comment briefly as well? Look, I mean, I think the rare earth thing is really important and really interesting. But here is an example of a radical uncertainty that affects lots of this policy making. On chips, you have global dependence on a factory in Taiwan. And Chip War, this book by Chris Miller, a professor at Tufts, is absolutely superb. I recommend it. And he and I were colleagues at Yale, and sets it out well. On the rare earth side, it's tempting to say, well, where are all the rare earths? On land, a lot of them are concentrated in China. But if you take a global perspective, many are under the sea. They're near some of the fissures in the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. So if people remember the obsession with manganese nodules in the early 1980s, it's super nerdy, by the way. But there was a whole debate about could you do deep sea mining of manganese? We didn't really have a technology in the early 1980s to do deep sea mining. We do today. When I say we, I don't mean the British government. De Beers commercially extracts diamonds off the coast of southern Africa. It spent hundreds of millions of dollars on ocean-going vessels that do it. And in fact, in one of the mines that they, one of the subsea mines that they exploit, they take up more diamonds from the below the sea than they do from the land. So one of the interesting dynamics here is what's the knock-on consequence from some of these forms of competition into other areas, into space. Look at some of the debates around GPS and GPS spoofing this week. Good piece in the Financial Times today. But also subsea resources. So what do we see potentially? Great power competition. Everybody's a bit alarmed, but we forget a little bit that that was actually the normal for an awful long time. We've just lived through a bit of an intermission when we got used to it not being normal.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of an excellent exploration of cybersecurity and cyber diplomacy. Please put your hands together for an excellent chair and an excellent panel. Just before you go, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about forthcoming World Affairs events at the BLSI. In December, we have a talk on how grief has changed, how grief has changed from the past to the present. That's in December. In January, we have a talk on the authoritarian international, how authoritarian regimes have changed since the fall of the Soviet Empire. And then in February, we have a talk by two professors beaming in from America to this room on the war in the Ukraine to map out future trajectories as to how this could possibly end. So those are the next 3 months. There's plenty more online, but for now, have a very safe journey home. All the very best.